Let's begin with a simple but dangerous question. What if education isn't really about learning? What if it's about training not your mind, but your obedience? Now, before you click away, ask yourself, why is it that some of the most educated people you know are also the most afraid to speak, to challenge, or to change? We're told education is the path to freedom. But what if it's actually the path to conformity disguised as enlightenment? That's what this video is going to challenge. We're going to dig into the shocking possibility that what we call education might be the most sophisticated system of social control ever invented. And by the end of this video, you won't just see school differently, you'll see yourself differently. Because the question isn't just what you learned. It's why you were taught it in the first place. Let's start with the structure. The modern education system was born during the Industrial Revolution not to create thinkers, but to create workers. Schools were modeled after factories. Bells rang at regular intervals. Children sat in rows. Obedience was rewarded, but questioning was punished. You were trained not to think freely, but to follow instructions, not to create, but to comply. And this wasn't an accident. It was a design. Big governments and industrialists needed a population that could function in factories, follow orders, and fit into a system. So they created schools that did exactly that. And we still use that model today. We call it education, but what we're really doing is conditioning. And conditioning you to sit still, to raise your hand, to ask permission, to memorize, repeat, obey.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Now think about your own schooling. How much of it was about discovery, and how much of it was about discipline? How often were you rewarded for curiosity, and how often were you punished for stepping outside the lines? Most of us were taught early on that the goal is to get the right answer, not to ask the right question. That success means scoring well on a test, not thinking differently. That failure is shameful rather than essential. And what's the result? A society full of people who know how to follow rules but don't know how to rewrite them. People who are afraid to fail, afraid to dream, afraid to disobey. That's not education. That's obedience training with a diploma at the end. And here's where it gets even more disturbing. This system doesn't just teach you to obey others. It teaches you to obey yourself, or rather, the internalized voice of authority that school implants deep inside you. You start policing your own thoughts. You start judging your own curiosity. You start asking, is this on the test? Will this be graded? Is this allowed? And over time, that voice becomes louder than your own intuition. That's why so many people graduate with honors and then live lives of quiet desperation. Because they've learned how to succeed in a system, but not how to live in the real world. They've been trained to follow but not to lead, to memorize facts but not to feel truth, to obey the rules but not to question whether those rules make sense. Let's pause here and ask something dangerous. What part of you has been educated into silence? Maybe it's the part that wanted to be an artist but got told to be realistic. Maybe it's the part that questioned religion or politics or gender roles and got told to stay in your lane. Maybe it's the part that felt things deeply, saw things differently, dreamed things wildly, and got told to grow up. That's education doing its job, not liberating you but domesticating you, taming your wildness, then flattening your soul, turning your fire into compliance. and yet we don't rebel. Why? Because we've been taught that education is sacred, that it's the path to success, that questioning it is dangerous, even disrespectful. But let's be clear, questioning a system doesn't mean rejecting learning. It means demanding real learning. Learning that empowers instead of pacifies. Learning that awakens instead of anesthetizes. Learning that disrupts instead of conforms. And that kind of learning almost never happens inside a classroom. It happens in life, in failure, in rebellion, in curiosity, in the messy, uncomfortable, beautiful places where real growth happens. So why does this matter now more than ever? Because we live in a time where obedience is being coded into our lives at every level. Algorithms decide what we see. Institutions decide what we can say. Social media punishes dissent. And schools still prepare us to fit in rather than to stand out. But the future doesn't belong to the obedient. It belongs to the awake, to the ones who can think critically, feel deeply, and act boldly. To the ones who don't just memorize the facts, but ask who wrote the textbook. Who don't just pass the test, but wonder who designed it. Who don't just sit in the classroom, but question why the classroom exists. Here's a personal challenge. Take one belief, just one that you were taught in school, and ask, who benefits from me believing this? Maybe it's the idea that history is linear, or that success means money, but that authority is always right, that intelligence can be measured by grades. What if those ideas aren't facts but tools? Tools used to shape your behavior, your identity, your future. That's not education. That's engineering. And the only way to break free is to start unlearning. Because unlearning is the most radical act of education. It's when you begin to strip away the conditioning, the programming, the obedience, and start building your own understanding of truth. Not because someone told you, but because you discovered it. That's the kind of education that changes lives, that heals societies, that rewrites the future. In the next part, we'll go even deeper and ask, if education makes us obedient, who benefits from our obedience? We'll explore how governments, corporations, and even democracies quietly depend on an educated population that doesn't question too much. And we'll ask the most dangerous question of all: what does it take to truly educate a free mind? Let's pick up where we left off, because now we're asking the question that changes everything. If education trains us to obey, then who benefits from our obedience? This isn't just a philosophical question, it's an economic, political, and cultural revelation. Because once you understand that education is not neutral, you begin to see that it serves someone. And if it's not always serving you, then who is it serving? The answer is buried in every standardized test, every school bell, every rule that tells you what to wear, how to speak, and what to believe. Education trains you to function within a system, but rarely to question the system itself. And that's exactly what the system needs to survive. Let's be real. Obedience is profitable. A society full of obedient workers is easier to manage, easier to tax, easier to control. Think about it. Why do schools emphasize punctuality, neatness, repetition, and quietness? Because these are traits that fit perfectly into bureaucracies and corporations. You're trained to be on time, to follow directions, to compete for approval, to fear failure, and to internalize that your worth is tied to external validation. That's not education. That's psychological scaffolding for capitalism. And no, this isn't some anti-capitalist rant, it's just a fact. The economy requires millions of people to accept roles they didn't choose, to perform tasks they didn't design, and to serve goals they didn't create. And the smoother that process runs, the better it is for those at the top. So, of course, the system rewards schools that produce that kind of obedience. Of course, it funds institutions that reinforce the status quo. Because education isn't just about knowledge, it's about shaping what kind of citizen you become. Look at how curriculums are designed. Who decides what you're taught in history? Whose version of events? Why is rebellion often framed as dangerous rather than necessary? Why are workers, activists, and revolutionaries reduced to footnotes? Why do we learn more about wars than about peace building? More about memorizing dates than understanding power dynamics? It's not an accident. It's not a conspiracy. It's a design. A design that ensures you learn just enough to be productive, but not so much that you become disruptive. Because disruption threatens the system. Disruption asks uncomfortable questions. Disruption refuses to play by the rules. And the system doesn't want that. It wants obedience with a smile, rebellion only in art class, and questions only if they can be answered by the textbook. But let's not stop there. Because education doesn't just serve governments or corporations, it also serves ideologies. Think about how early we're taught to pledge allegiance, to accept national myths, to absorb cultural norms as unquestioned truths. This kind of soft indoctrination happens so early and so subtly that by the time you're old enough to ask why, you've already internalized the answer. And once ideology becomes identity, any question feels like betrayal. That's how obedience evolves from something enforced to something volunteered. You don't just obey because you're told to, you obey because you believe it's who you are. That's why it's so hard to break free. Because you're not just challenging a rule, you're challenging a piece of yourself. Now ask yourself this: how many of your deepest beliefs are actually yours? Not the ones you've repeated, not the ones that feel right. The ones you've tested. The ones you've torn apart, questioned, doubted, and then rebuilt. That's real education. That's dangerous education. And that's exactly what the system doesn't want. Because when you start doing that, you don't just become less obedient, you become less predictable, less profitable, less manipulable. And that makes you powerful. Let's make this real. Imagine a world where every child learned how to think critically from the age of 5, where they were taught how to spot propaganda, how to analyze systems, how to understand psychological manipulation, where they studied not just history but who gets to write history, where they learned how to debate without conforming, to cooperate without submitting, to question without fear. That world would be radically different. It would be more democratic, more just, more creative, and far less controllable. And that's exactly why we don't live in that world. Because the people who benefit from the current hierarchy, politicians, billionaires, corporations, don't want that world. They want a world of educated obedience, just enough knowledge to function, not enough to challenge. So what do we do with all this? We start by waking up. We stop pretending that education is always virtuous. We stop romanticizing schools as temples of truth. and we start reclaiming what education should be, the unrelenting pursuit of wisdom, not the passive consumption of facts. An education that teaches you how to think, not what to think, that gives you tools, not answers, that breaks your mind open, not boxes it in. And we do this not just to criticize the system, but to evolve beyond it. Because the future doesn't belong to the most obedient, it belongs to the most awake, the ones who can navigate complexity, who can think independently, who can lead without being led, who can imagine something better and then build it. So I'll leave you with this question. What would your mind look like if it had never been trained to obey? Would you still believe in the things you believe in now? Would you still define success the way you do? Would you still fear failure or authority or standing out? Or would you be something else, something freer, wilder, more dangerous, more alive? In the next part, we'll explore how to reclaim real education not in schools, but in life. We'll break down how to unlearn obedience, rebuild your inner voice, and create a personal philosophy that no system can control. Now we confront the final question, the one that turns this from theory into transformation. If modern education makes us obedient, how do we unlearn that obedience? Because the truth is, we can't change the system overnight. But we can begin where all revolutions begin, with the individual, or with you, with me, with the decision to reclaim the one thing the system tried to take from us without ever making it obvious, our freedom of thought. And this isn't some abstract idea. This is real. Because obedience isn't just something that happens in school, it becomes a habit, a reflex, a lens through which we view the world, and until we strip it away, until we confront it, we'll never really think for ourselves. We'll just keep obeying quietly, efficiently, politely, believing that we're thinking while we're really just performing. So how do we begin to unlearn obedience? The first step is to recognize the voice in your mind that isn't yours. The one that tells you to stay safe, and to be realistic, to avoid conflict, and to follow the rules even when they make no sense. That voice has been trained into you. And it's not evil, it was put there to help you survive in a world that rewards conformity. But if you've ever felt a tension between what you want to say and what you should say, if you've ever felt yourself shrinking to fit into a role, or suppressing your ideas because they might be too much, then you felt that voice. And the only way to reclaim your mind is to start talking back to it, not with anger, but with curiosity. Ask it, who taught you to think this way? Whose fears are you echoing? Whose approval do you still need, even now? Because once you name that voice, you can begin to disarm it. And once it loses its grip, you begin to hear something else, your own voice, unfiltered, unapologetic, untrained. The second step is to practice intellectual rebellion, not for the sake of being edgy, but for the sake of being free. That means questioning even the ideas that feel comfortable, especially the ones that feel righteous. Because the real test of independent thought isn't whether you can criticize your enemies, it's whether you can question your heroes, whether you can examine the beliefs that make you feel safe, whether you can hold ambiguity without rushing to label it. That's what obedience fears the most, uncertainty. Because obedience thrives on clarity, on rules, on categories. But real thought lives in the gray. It dances in paradox. It doesn't need a conclusion to feel whole. So practice this. Ask yourself, what is one belief I've never questioned because I assumed it was always true? And then hold that belief in your hands, turn it around, break it apart, not to destroy it, but to understand it. Because even if you return to that belief, you'll return to it by choice, not by training. The third step is emotional, and it's the hardest. Because unlearning obedience means confronting fear. Not just the fear of punishment, but the fear of rejection, or of being misunderstood, of being alone. Because obedience is often a social strategy. We obey to belong. We conform to be accepted. And once you start to break out of that pattern, people will notice. They'll say you've changed. You've become difficult. You're overthinking things. You're making them uncomfortable. And they'll be right, because you have changed. You're no longer playing the role that made them feel safe. You're becoming real, and realness disrupts comfort. That's the price of freedom. But here's the truth they never told you: the discomfort doesn't last. In fact, on the other side of that discomfort is something incredible: clarity. You begin to attract people who respect you for who you are, not who you pretend to be. You begin to create, speak, live from a place that is rooted, not rehearsed. And that is where real power begins. And finally, the last step is to re-educate yourself and to become your own teacher, your own philosopher, your own experiment. That means reading outside the canon, studying perspectives that challenge your worldview, surrounding yourself with people who make you think, not just agree. It means turning your life into a laboratory of consciousness, watching how you respond to discomfort, and noticing when you self-censor, asking why you crave approval, and then using that data not to judge yourself but to understand yourself. That's real education, education that liberates, education that expands, education that makes you dangerous in the best way possible. Because here's the secret: the system can't handle people who think for themselves. It doesn't know what to do with someone who can't be manipulated by guilt, fear, or shame. Someone who doesn't just react to information but transforms it. Someone who doesn't just fit into roles but creates them. That's you if you choose to be, and that choice doesn't come from a school. It comes from your soul. So ask yourself now, what would your life look like if you stopped obeying and started listening to yourself, to your instincts, to your truth? What would you build, write, say, destroy, heal, love, or become if you were no longer afraid of getting it wrong? If you stopped asking for permission and started asking for meaning, that's the future of education. Not a classroom, not a lecture, but a fire. A fire inside you that refuses to go out, no matter how many rules they throw at you. You are not here to be obedient. You are here to be awake, to be alive, to be free. And that begins the moment you stop asking what you're allowed to think and start asking what you were born to discover.